there's a real clash that, between science and religion in, modern religious doctrines.
You went down the route of science, right? You became a surgeon.
How does evolution fit into the current atheistic belief? Like, what are some of the challenges with the current theory?
Peace be on you and welcome to Hakam Inspire. Today we're going to be talking about evolution, the debate around evolution, and some of the Islamic aspects as well. And we've got today with us Dr Adeel Bajwa, who is a consultant surgeon here in the United Kingdom. Dr Adeel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Peace be upon you all.
Dr. Adeel, tell us a bit about evolution and what interested you to do some research into evolution.
There's a real identity challenge when you're growing up, when you're sort of a minority, when other people are obviously different. And that extends to religion. What you find in this country is that certainly in sort of primary, secondary school level, there's almost no interest in religion in any of the students. I would say it's almost completely zero. And then strange things happen when you're in secondary school or university, particularly. People start developing a bit more interest. But if you delve into that interest, it's often a cultural thing. It's people thinking about their own identity again. They're like thinking, well, who do I belong to? What's my background? And so then they'll start attaching themselves to religion almost as a cultural identity thing. And an example is, you would find, Muslims who would be drinking and going to nightclubs, but suddenly in Ramzan they'll start fasting because they feel as if that's something that they should be doing. They feel as if they're not, then they're sort of neglecting their parents or they're neglecting their background. So it's still really a cultural thing, rather than something that they believe in deeply. And that's a challenge I faced. I didn't really feel there was any merit in following something just because your parents do. And you'll know there's verses in the Quran that reject that rhetorically. It says, there's many verses that will know that, why are you following what your parents are doing when you know that they're in manifest error? So that sort of thought process also extended to religion. So what am I going to do? Am I going to follow Islam just because my parents, are Muslim? So why wouldn't I reject religion as well? Because in this country, the prevalent religion is atheism. And what drives atheism is a feeling that it's a very logical thing. It's very logical. It's science, basically, isn't it? That's the backbone of atheism, is scientific thought. And there's a real clash that, between science and religion in, modern religious doctrines.
You went down the route of science, right? You became a surgeon. So how did that kind of pan out for you, especially in terms of your Islamic theology that you were saying that your parents were following and you were questioning?
Well, clearly, I believe in science. Someone as a student of science, particularly biology, human biology, I believe in it. So that raised the question: then how does that fit in with me? With my religion, is it consistent, or is there a contradiction? Because the contemporary feeling is that there is a contradiction. You can't really believe in religion and believe in science. There's a clash.
Sure, that's the common kind of perception nowadays, isn't it?
That's a common perception. And, when you delve into it deeper, what is it about science that, rejects religion? And that's logic and evidence. And, that seems to suggest that you don't need a creator. And at the forefront of that is evolution. Evolution is at the forefront of that. And if you read modern evolutionary theory by biologists like Richard Dawkins, he is a foremost atheist as well. So it goes hand in hand. If you read his books, he takes evolution and says, look, evolution negates the need for a creator. We can explain creation through evolution, so that means you don't need a God. In fact, he says it's a much better explanation, because most, again, religious doctrines will have their theory of creation, theory of evolution is that God simply created animals, sophisticated animals, without any process.
I think it's interesting you say that, and we're gonna, of course, go into these theories. But like you're saying, it's become Darwinian evolution. It's like Darwinian evolutionary humanism, kind of. It's become a religion in itself, where it's this is the way, and this is how everything happens, and this is scientific fact. Whereas there's plenty of evolutionary scientists who don't believe in Darwinian evolution, of course. So it's the debate is still on the table, but like you're saying, it's become a kind of religion in itself, and a lot of other scientists actually refer to this scientific dogma, if you like, as dogma, and they do say that. For example, there's scientists who say that Darwin is the god, in evolution, quote unquote, and that there was that. It's another scientist said that it's Darwinian or Neo-Darwinian evolution theory is as if it's an Anglo-Saxon religion.
So I think the key challenge is, how do you fit in, the evidence of evolution into religion? And the evidence is, it's compelling. It's very, when you look at fossil records, you can see, progressive change. And actually, even in living organisms, you will see evolution, in action. And I'll give you an example. Is if you look at the human eye, the human eye is a very complex, evolved sensory organ. But you will find simpler, more primitive versions of the eye in existence today. You can, and if you can, to the extent that you can actually chart the evolution of the eye, and if you think about it, how would it start? The eye starts as a simple light sensor on an organism that tells the organism where the sun is. So for a plant, that's great, isn't it? It can grow towards a plant, and then you develop a concavity, so it turns into a little concave, a little ditch, and then the light that allows the organism to know where the light is coming from, and that ditch becomes like a cave, like a pinhole camera. Eventually, it can evolve into a pinhole camera, and then you can develop light and color, and you can see so on and so forth. And those examples exist. There'll be snails who have a pinhole camera as an eye, so you can physically see that things have evolved, things have changed, genetically, and with the discovery of DNA, that was really the further ammunition to this. We could actually, there's a real mechanism. You've got DNA, which is this code which codes for proteins, it codes for everything we have, and you can see how this has changed bit by bit in a cumulative way. The problem, I think, is that in religion, for religion is, creationism has become so prevalent. There's this concept that you're either a creationist or you believe in the science of evolution.
So if you could just define creationism as well, just for those since you are aware.
Most people would take that to mean that it's a theory that God created everything without this process of evolution from clay. So human beings were just put on the earth by whatever supernatural mechanism you can think of. That's difficult for someone logical to believe in, because there's so much evidence. So evolution, that process of change, for sure has happened. But and this is what my real interest is, and my inspiration is a man called Hazrat Mirza Ahmad, who was the fourth successor of the promised Messiah, the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, an extraordinary man. He was a great influence of me growing up, just by the sheer grace of God. He was in this country when he migrated here from Pakistan, and he wrote a very well-known book, Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge and Truth, and that really opened my eyes up to what the truth is. And in Islam, the truth is always the middle road, and there is a middle road. You can tie religion up with modern evolutionary evidence.
So, Dr. Adeel, before we get into this aspect of how evolution fits into religion and Islam in particular, just before that, I just want to go back a step and look at what you said earlier, where how does evolution fit into the current atheistic belief? Like, what are some of the challenges with the current theory, and why as a scientist would some of these things raise eyebrows and suggest otherwise?
Well, there is obviously a mechanism that they see. There is evidence that things have changed with time, and they fit that into this theory that mutations happen. There's change at the genetic level, at the DNA level, which is random. So this is the Neo-Darwinian theory. There's a random error that happens in your DNA, okay, completely random, and those changes are of various kinds. So those changes could be positive for the organism, or they could be negative. But those positive ones, those positive in terms of giving that animal a better ability to survive, they are, those changes are chosen because that animal survives and is able to have more children, and those changes becomes more prevalent. And if you repeat that step, as the theory says, if you repeat it, millions and millions of times over millions and millions of years, then you can get a gradual cumulative change of that organism towards something that can survive better. And that is what the animals that exist today. They're evolved, they've changed over millions of years. The challenge, though, the real flaw in that argument is that if you look at it, go into detail, it becomes very obvious on a scientific level that those changes could not have happened single step at a time. And we can go into that in detail, but single step doesn't work when you're trying to coordinate certain aspects of evolution. You can't do it at a single step level. So where does that leave the atheist? I think a lot of people who study evolution would probably understand there's a problem here. And this is actually quite well known. There's conferences on this. This challenge is well known to the atheists. They realize that actually it doesn't quite make sense. The single step isn't going to solve some of the issues of evolution. But there's nowhere else for these people to go. There's no alternative theory that's well known. The alternative theory would be creationism, which is just logically doesn't make sense. So they stick with it. And they're just sort of hoping that something's going to happen.
What are some of these kind of challenges that you're talking about? These in detail, random effects of evolution or mutations that don't tie in together.
Well, the eye is an excellent example, and again, this is picked up in the book Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge and Truth, which anyone interested in evolution must read. The challenge, you see, that when you look at the description of the evolution of the eye, they do it at the level of the eyeball. Okay, so all the examples that we went through, the patch, that light sensitive patch, the concavity, the pinhole camera, this is all evolution of the eyeball. Okay, and the evolution of the eyeball, but the eye is not something that exists on its own. It's part of the optic system, right? And the optic system is very complicated. You just think of a practical example. If I'm not sure if you've had your dinner, but if something very delicious, a delicious cake was put in front of you, right, you would see it. So your eyeball's seeing that cake, but that information is not just kept in the eyeball. That information is sent down the optic nerve. It's sent to the midbrain. It goes to the visual cortex, and then there's a whole host of nerves that will respond to that. So that information has to be sent to a center. The information has to be collated, and there's a response. And that response is, you'd feel hunger. Your stomach will start churning. You'll get excited. Your heart rate might go up. There's various things happen. So the eye is a part of a system. So if you have an evolutionary change in the eyeball, just say however minute, some sort of beneficial change, in order for that change to become a survival advantage, that organism has to also evolve the optic nerve to carry that new information. You would also need to evolve the visual cortex. Like, just imagine you've got the most minutest change that allows you to start seeing color vision. Okay? For that mutation to become a survival advantage in that organism, that new information has to pass down the optic nerve, and that new information of color has to be interpreted in the visual cortex, and then the organism has to respond. It has to know how to, what the difference between green and brown is. It needs to know that, and that's the difference between eating, and that, vegetation that's healthy or vegetation that's dead. So that means you need to have, mutations in those different components, and they have to happen in that same generation. You can't, and the reason it has to happen in the same generation is because without all those changes happening at the same time, there's no survival advantage to that animal.
Right.
And that, that's a very simple, obvious concept. If we just spend, a few minutes looking at it, it's as obvious as anything else in evolution.
You have these, holes in the theory of evolution and what the current explanations are for it. But there's a lot in the theory of evolution and Darwinian evolution, which is acceptable as, Muslims as well. So it'd be good to, your journey into kind of looking at this as, like you were saying, a Muslim youth who was questioning their faith as well, and where science can tie in. So let's talk about evolution in the sense where Islam and the Quran kind of coincides and accepts a lot of, because there is a lot out there about evolution which actually is very much in accordance to the Quran.
Yeah, I mean, the scientific facts, of course, I accept. I mean, I'm just talking from a personal aspect, but this is, I think, fits with Islamic theory as well. We accept that evolution has happened. The question is, how do we, account for this discrepancy? How do we account for the fact that the genetic changes, need to be coordinated? They need to be sort of multi-step. And multi-step, you can look at this in a sort of a mathematical way as well. Mutations at the genetic level, if they're random, if you look at what is the chance of a mutation in the eyeball, in one aspect of the eyeball? A random mutation happens very rarely, okay, very rarely. And when it does happen, only a small number of those changes are going to be advantageous. A lot of those changes are going to be, not advantageous, and that you see that in human pathology. You have genetic conditions of the eye which are not helpful most of the time. So the probability of you getting a random mutation in the eyeball that is advantageous, and the probability of a random mutation in that same generation happening in the optic nerve and the visual cortex becomes a mathematical impossibility. Even you take one example, you'd never see it in the history of mankind. The mathematics will tell you that. So the question is then, if it's not random, how can it happen? And this is when, this is something that I'm still researching into and trying to understand. I think this goes into what we understand by randomness. And you'd have to go, if you look at quantum physics, you will see that actually randomness becomes, a different concept. There's things like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, Brownian motion. These are things that will tell us that we don't even know, with certainty, where an electron is in relation to the atom. So this is an uncertainty, and this uncertainty is unpredictable uncertainty. And that really, these sort of discoveries that are happening, they've destroyed this concept of, I know this is a separate subject, but it's destroyed the concept of scientific materialism. And that's the concept is that if you know all the laws of science, if you know all the information of all, where everything sits, you can predict the future. But we know that that will never happen now. You don't know that because there's an element of unpredictable uncertainty that exists at the atomic level, and that would manifest at at the biological level as well, because mutations are errors of molecules on DNA. So these are groups of atoms. So what that allows, in my opinion, that allows for patterns to happen in science. There's a scientific mechanism for patterns to happen, for things to happen which actually are not random. And this is what you see in evolution. Look at evolution. What you will see is extraordinary patterns, extraordinary information. And we look at what animals can do. They can do things that far beyond the reach of human accomplishments. In terms of aviation, in terms of sonar technology, in terms of healing. I mean, I'll give you an example as a surgeon. Just think of the concept that if you cut yourself with a knife, what would happen? Well, if you keep the wound clean, that cut that you have will completely heal up by itself. You won't have to do anything. I mean, that's we're used to that, but actually, if you step back and think, my God, what's going on? It's something healing itself. It's almost like a supernatural thing, but it's not. And those examples in science and nature are there's millions of those. From the honeybee to the sonar technology of bats, to how whales communicate with themselves. So these are patterns. These are signs. These are signs that there's intelligence. That there's something that is super intelligent that has created the animal kingdom.
I think this goes back to, now this is where the divide is coming in, right? So a lot of people so like you said, as Muslims, we have no issue, apart from, one or two, with the general theory of evolution that we developed in stages, from lower life forms to more complex ones. Like you're saying, and anyone out there who is, who's not unsure, Islamically, as Muslims, we accept this. The only issue, like you're saying here, is this element of there not being intelligent design and everything happening randomly, and like the common term goes is blind evolution. So it's interesting you describe all of that, because as Muslims, of course, we believe that all of this at every level was guided and it wasn't random. And like you're saying, it can be explained scientifically as well. There's no issue with that. So, you as a doctor as well, it's I think for all our listeners out there, students who haven't gone into science or biology, it's actually quite logical as well that these things can happen. But like you're saying, they can only happen if there's an intelligent designer behind them.
For sure. And this is the crux of the logic behind Islam. Science and religion go hand in hand, and they need to go hand in hand. How can there be a clash between the word of God and the creation of God? If there was, then you would say the word of God is from one God and the creation of God is from another God. But there isn't. There's one God. This is the unity of God. And you often hear people talk about unity of God. What does that mean? Well, it means that in this example, that obviously that all sources of intelligence and knowledge is coming from one source. And if I may, there's many verses of the Holy Quran that describe this. Many, and you'll be astonished. There's almost more verses of the Holy Quran that talk about science and studying science than anything else. And this is one from chapter 67 as one of many examples. Blessed is he in whose hand is the kingdom, and he has power over all things, who has created death and life, that he might try you, which of you is best in deeds. And he is the mighty, the most forgiving, who has created 7 heavens in harmony. No incongruity can thou see in the creation of God. Then look again, seest thou any flaw? And look again, and yet again, thy sight will return to thee confused and fatigued. So that verse is, it's just an extraordinary verse that says there's perfection in science, there's perfection in revelation, where does that perfection come from? It comes from one source. It's the same thing. So study science, study evolution, and you will see these signs. I mean, I wouldn't say it's to the level of a proof. It's not a proof. It's a sign. It gives you the feeling that God should exist. But then that next journey, in my opinion, that next journey, I mean, that's determined by God Himself. If there's an intelligent creator, then the means of knowing Him will be, for Him to decide. And that journey is, prayer. It's, meditation. It's good deeds. And it's a tough journey. It's a tough journey, but that's a journey that an individual will make, and a motivated individual. And part of that motivation you can get by studying science and evolution.
The Quran does say focus or ponder. Actually, it says believers are those who ponder over the creation of the heavens and the earth. So you like to be a proper believer, you have to do this pondering. You have to reflect. You growing up, as you said, in the United Kingdom, there's this clash of culture, clash of identity, clash of religions. How did you kind of get into this, especially for those youth who are listening, who are going through a similar journey? How did you start off? You went in depth with evolution because that's a common thing which determines all life and our existence. But how did you what are the stepping stones of getting into this as a Muslim who's pondering over these things?
Well, it's in the books I've read. The most logical book I've read is The Philosophy of the Teaching of Islam, which in the English language is for me the foremost book of religion, philosophy, knowledge, truth that I've ever read. And it's mind blowing. That's something that really triggers it. And also the other works of of the promised Messiah, the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Victory of Islam is an example. These these books really inspired me. And when you read those, there's logic in there. The arguments put forward by the Messiah, of the Holy Prophet of Muhammad, peace be upon him, it's logical. It makes sense. And obviously, ultimately, it's the Holy Quran. Read the verses of the Holy Quran are there to inspire, and they do.
I think that's the kind of difficult element for many atheists nowadays, where essentially they believe in science, they recognize evolution, the theory of evolution as being scientific. And as soon as you start to deconstruct and start to highlight the concerns or the flaws within the argument, they turn to the other side is creationism. God created the world in 7 days. They take things very literally. There's no element of evolution. The Islam presented by the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and as explained by the Reformer, the Promised Messiah, peace be upon him, that is very logical. And like you mentioned, his caliphs have done further research and explained this in much more detail. And it puts forward this kind of argument that why can't there be a higher power that is an intelligent designer that has facilitated this process of evolution? And I think when you start putting that argument out for atheists, it kind of causes a bit of concern, because that means that there is potentially a God, and that potentially necessitates trying to recognize him, trying to, gain that element of spirituality. That means that there's more than just our physical selves, our morality. There is an element of spirituality. So I think, from yourself, from talking to atheists or perhaps doing research, have you found that as well?
Ultimately, it comes down to a level of interest. An atheist, deep down, they must know, studying evolution, they must know there's issues, and we know that. There's conferences on these things where they're looking at the issues, but it's very difficult for them to start thinking about intelligent design. But that's not to say that there aren't people in the scientific community who believe in intelligent design. And an example would be Stephen Meyer, and I would encourage people to read his works. He is, a scientist, but he's taken evolution, he's studied it, and he concludes there is intelligence behind this. The next step becomes a lot harder. I mean, that next step is really, of finding that intelligent designer, finding that, the challenge of devoting yourself to, to finding a God. I mean, that's a spiritual journey that requires a huge amount of effort. And, the reality is, there's probably not that many people around at the moment who are interested in doing that journey. There's so much, materialism and other things, to take away, to distract, people at the moment, that they're not making that journey. But, we know that these things change all the time.
I think it's worth highlighting, just literally off that, just one point, it's worth highlighting that those people, there are people who have interest in this realm, and not just Muslims. For example, there's a Canadian professor, Keith Moore, who is a surgeon as well and an embryologist. So he's studied embryology to, the process start to finish, and he recognizes and has published papers recognizing that the process described within the Quran is absolutely correct. So it does come down to this level of interest. I completely agree with you that those individuals who are interested, who want to explore and truly find whether evolution, the theory of evolution, is actually true, or whether there is sort of the possibility that there's an intelligent designer guiding this process, those individuals can do research, and there is material out there for them to kind of go off and
I think it's also important to mention, from my personal perspective, I'm not talking and pretending that I'm this great enlightened person that has made this journey because I'm special. It was very, very easy for me, and the reason is that in front of me was this this huge intelligence, this great man, Mirza, may God be pleased with him, talking at very small function sometimes, and I was there. He wrote the book, and of course I was going to read it. My background, I was always inclined not to be prejudicial against these sort of books, so it's very easy for my background to have done that. What becomes a lot harder, much harder, I think, for someone who's not from that background, has brought up without the influence of their parents to make that journey. But there are people who do it, and I know examples in my mind. The history of our organization. There's people who've made that journey, and they are truly extraordinary people. In this country, Bashir Orchard Saab would be one. There's many examples of these people who've made these great journeys.
100%. These journeys, actually, there's more and more people becoming interested in them as well. Especially like we've been discussing, we've gone through that schooling of a very atheistic environment, but now maybe it's because of COVID, or everyone's having these questions about life, and there's more and more interest in religion. But like you're saying, as someone who is going through that kind of the clash of religion, science, and the worldview and atheists, there is a guiding light, and if you want to, you can, like you're saying, start off by gaining that knowledge. You have lots of books, and of course, as Ahmadi Muslims, a lot of these books, like you've just said, the Philosophy of Teachings of Islam, Revelation, Rationality, are available on alislam.org, free of charge. Anyone can read them. But then, like Dr. Adeel, you've been talking about, is that journey, those steps then to take are all personal. You have to put in the hard work of praying, of kind of following the guidelines which the Quran describes, to truly understand or find or develop that connection, of course, towards God.
Yeah, definitely. But I think there's also nothing to fear in these atheistic arguments. There's absolutely nothing to fear at all. If you go in there logically, scientifically, if you go into that mindset, if you're completely open, then you'll find the signs of the existence of God. That's what it says in the Holy Quran, and ironically, I think there's many people in the scientific community who become unscientific in the way they use this knowledge. And Richard Dawkins is one of the best examples of that. I mean, he makes fun of religious mullahs and extremists all the time, but what he doesn't realize is that actually the way he has become one of those. He's got his own dogma. It's identical. He doesn't see the arguments. I mean, and some of his arguments are incredibly weak. I mean, I'll give you one example. One example he talks about about the existence of God. He says that God cannot exist because if God exists, then you would have to explain who created God. And it's a very weak circular argument because you could logically you'd look at it and said, well, look, God has created everything. He's also created creation. The concept of creation is created by God. So he wouldn't be entrapped by his own creation. But they become very, they turn into mullahs themselves. The mullahs they mock. They don't realize that they themselves have become that mullah.
Yeah, they become dogmatic themselves. And, one purpose of this podcast, of this episode especially, is to show that there's plenty of people out there who have studied the science, who have gone deep into the sciences. Their careers are based on science as well. And they believe in God. They have a lot of people are agnostic scientists. They're agnostic. They don't know. And like you're saying, there's plenty who do believe. So it's not just, the new aged atheists who are, the end, the final say to everything. There's plenty of scientists who aren't sure, or they leave the possibility out there, or they are believers themselves. But Dr. Adeel, it's been a great conversation, really interesting, and especially from the angle of your journey as a young Muslim and facing these challenges here in the West, in the UK, and then overcoming those challenges. And then, you're on this journey of discovery and you've discovered a lot. And like you're saying, we're all students, we're all continuing to continue that journey, but it helps, science and religion, they're not contradictory. And that journey does work, of course. Thank you for for being on the podcast, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening to the Al-Hakam Inspire podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Visit our socials on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at Al-Hakam Inspire. And of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave your comments there. We would love to hear your feedback and thoughts, so send us an email to inspire@alhakam.org.